Hello, Johnny from Eurogamer here, and this is Cyberpunk 2077. Of course, you almost certainly knew that already because this footage is actually taken from the demo shown off at E3 2018. I saw roughly 50 minutes of brand new gameplay at this year's show, but of course that was a behind closed doors demo, and that footage isn't actually out yet for the general public to see. That's not going to stop me talking about it though, because there was a hell of a lot to like in Cyberpunk's offering at E3 2019, and one fairly significant thing I really wasn't sold on. So without any further ado, here are 6 things we liked about Cyberpunk 2077, and 1 thing we didn't. First up, the most exciting thing we got to see in the new gameplay demo was a proper look at net running. Now, net running in Cyberpunk 2020 involves drilling down through a series of maps, starting with a global one, until you reach the city block and then the building in which the data you require is stored. This is because the layout of the net in 2020 roughly correlates to real-world geography. In other words, net running is a matter of navigating a series of mazes in order to avoid security programs and gain access to the stuff you want. If you're interested in hearing more about how it works in Cyberpunk 2020, I made a whole bunch of videos on how the pen and paper game relates to 2077 last year, including one specifically on net running. The mechanics in Cyberpunk 2077, however, are very different, organised into a minigame that's not so much about navigating a physical space as choosing what parts of a system you want to attack and then zoning in on those as quickly as possible. See, at one point V, who in this part of the demo was operating on a strong Netrunner character build, jacked into a wall panel in order to open up a heavy security door. This opened up a menu in which a whole bunch of possible hacking outcomes were listed, each with a unique set of letters and numbers that had to be input in sequence in order to enable the functionality. Think of these as the passcodes, essentially. V, meanwhile, had a bunch of code fragments at his disposal, selecting from those in order to get the sequence right and get the job done, in this instance, opening a door. So basically it's a bit like hacking a computer password in Fallout, only with considerably less guesswork and considerably more time pressure. The cool thing about this mechanic is that, if you're quick enough, you can input more than one code. Although from the brief glimpse we saw on screen, I think putting in one code might limit which other ones you can then go for as a result of the shared characters in the passcode sequence. I'm not 100% on that one, to be honest. Either way, the thing we can take away from this is that hacking stuff in Cyberpunk 2077 is fast, it's effective, and it's up close and personal. And if that sounds very different to the way it works in 2020, well, you're right. It is, and there's a very good reason for that. After my demo time, I got a few minutes to speak with Mike Pondsmith, author of Cyberpunk and basically an RPG industry legend. He told me he's really happy with the way netrunning works in 2077 because he spent a lot of time working it out with everybody, and the way it works is far more similar to Cyberpunk Red than anything else. Now, Cyberpunk Red is the newest edition of the Cyberpunk tabletop role-playing game, set for release in August 2019. In it, netrunners are no longer sitting back in a comfy chair and influencing the action from afar, because switching to a netrunning section during a gameplay session tends to leave the other players idle for a bit. In other words, netrunning sections have kind of become a toilet or beer break for anyone who's not the GM or the netrunner, and that's just not much fun. In Cyberpunk Red then, the netrunner has to be with the group. They have to be at risk. They're hacking actual stuff in the physical environment around them, and they're doing it at close range. It's that ethos that's been carried over into 2077, and it definitely shows. Of course, netrunning is about as close to magic as you're going to get in Cyberpunk, and one of the coolest things we saw was V using a Kiroshi cyber optics implant, basically a fancy new eyeball, in order to hack objects in the world around them remotely. Infiltrating the stronghold of the Animals, a super hulked out faction in the Night City district of Pacifica, we snuck up on a guy training in a ring with a boxing robot. We hacked said robot and directed it to fight back, at which point it it nearly punched the guy's head off. Later on, we remotely hacked a rack of weights in order to drop them on a guy working out and crush him to death. Oh, and in combat we managed to tell someone's cybernetic arm to pull the pin on the grenade he was carrying, blowing him to smithereens. So yeah, net running. It's up close and personal, it's fast, and it can be pretty brutal. All in all, I'm impressed. Now, at this point you may be wondering whether cyberspace as we understand it from Cyberpunk 2020 has been completely done away with, and you can rest easy, because it hasn't. I'll come back to that later on. The second thing I really liked in the 2077 demo was seeing how your choice of life path in character creation can affect certain social situations. Now, a life path basically determines your background. Were you a nomad, or have you come from a fancy corporation, one of the most powerful factions in Night City, for example? Or maybe you grew up as a street kid. In our demo, V had a corporate background, but was mucking in with one of the street gangs of Night City. And at several points in the demo, we saw dialogue options listed, but greyed out, because we didn't have the street kid life path that would have given us the background knowledge necessary to connect with these gangsters and communicate with them on more level terms. If we were dealing with corpos, however, we would have been in our element and better able to engage with them. And sure, unique dialogue options based on your alignment are certainly nothing new in an RPG, but nonetheless it's nice to see that your life path actually influences the game in a meaningful sense, rather than just tweaking some of your base stats. Talking of stats though, the next thing we liked was how differently you can proceed through each level based on your character build. As I mentioned before, we saw V use their finely honed netrunner skills to hack open a door, but what if you didn't have the necessary netrunning skill? Well, thankfully, we got to see that too. Using a dev command to switch from male netrunner V to female solo V, a solo being Cyberpunk's term for a combat specialist, we approached the same door and, not fussed about any of that cybernetic nonsense, we just punched the crap out of it before tearing it open entirely. Now obviously that's not exactly the most subtle of approaches, and, sure enough, a big old fight immediately followed. And while admittedly this is an example of how two classes can get around the same obstacle, I'm fairly confident there will be certain routes in 2077 that will be entirely closed off to some players, and not to others. In other words, your character build determines how you can navigate the game's sandbox, what tactical options will be open to you, and also how much risk you're under at any one time. Being super strong is all well and good, after all, but you might still be overwhelmed by security systems if you don't have the technical wherewithal to neutralise them first. Now, this next item may not seem super exciting, but we got to have a look at vendors in Cyberpunk 2077 and the sort of thing they have to offer. Not only did we buy ourselves a sweet new jacket which instantly boosted our cool stat, but we got to see some demons on sale as well. Demons in Cyberpunk 2020 are basically walking, talking zip folders. They compress and carry around extra programs with them, and they also have a physical presence. In 2077, mind you, they're a bit different. These are effectively programs you can slot into hardware, giving you different abilities when you're net running. Again, the glimpse we got was tantalisingly brief, so I wasn't able to get specifics on any of the demons on offer, but it was nice to see how these things are manifested nonetheless. Over the course of the demo, we saw character creation, skill trees, stats and vendors, and all in all, they helped make 2077 come into focus as an actual, playable game that exists. Whereas last year's demo, i.e. the one you're watching right now, feels more like a beautiful dream, by contrast. The next thing we saw and liked in Cyberpunk 2077 was the driving, because quite frankly, it looks brilliant. In the demo last year, we got to see V driving around in a beefy muscle car, but this time round, it was a motorbike. Apparently there's a whole range of vehicles for you to putter about Night City in, and it's a good thing too, because the driving mechanics look very fluid and a lot of fun. Taking corners, zipping through streets, and changing between a first and third person perspective was all very fluid, and personally, I'd like to see what it looks like when you lose control and spang it into the nearest wall. But obviously the demo was being played by a CD Projekt developer, and so they weren't exactly prone to crashing the car. Oh well, And to round off the things we liked, before we get into the negatives, let's talk about cyberspace. I already mentioned in this video that the net as it's represented in 2020, i.e. a digital information network represented to a netrunner's senses as a physical place, was still very much a part of the game, and, true enough, we got to take a trip there with Johnny Silverhand himself. And you know what? It looked seriously cool. Very much like how I imagined the net to look in William Gibson's Neuromancer, to be quite honest. Pretty as it was also kind of a relief to see it there. As much as I like the sound of the new streamlined net running in Cyberpunk Red, and as much as I liked the mechanics in 2077, I'd still be sad to lose that digital realm. From what I understand, it's going to be a rarity both in Cyberpunk 2077 and in Cyberpunk Red to see it in action, but it's nice to see it there nonetheless. Okay, so that's 6 things we really liked about Cyberpunk 2077, now here's what we didn't like. And I'm sad to say, it's the combat. Now, while I did see a live gameplay demo, it was hands-off, so I can't say for sure how the combat feels, but honestly the shooting mechanics looked pretty flat. At one point V tore a massive machine gun free from a gun turret, and I really struggled to get any sense of heft or recoil from it. It sort of just went put 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 while enemy health bars ticked down, and there was a big pistol involved at one point that had a bit more oomph to it, but all in all, the shooting just didn't look like a whole lot of fun. Unfortunately, I got much the same feeling from the melee combat as well. Without playing it for myself, I can't exactly say what's off, but it just looked a bit, well, flimsy, to be honest. And of course the game isn't out until next year, and an awful lot can change from there, so hopefully it will be tightened up, but for the time being, it's definitely pushed me more toward playing a stealthy Netrunner style character than going all out solo. As disappointing as the combat in the demo was, in some ways it was reassuring to be disappointed, as odd as that sounds. As I mentioned briefly earlier, last year's demo was stunning, but it was hard to get a sense of Cyberpunk 2077 as an actual game. It felt more like a lofty promise than an actual product that might get finished and shipped and installed on a PC or a console. Now, however, 2077 feels very real. I have a very good sense of how it's going to play out, and there are some things, like the menu system, that seem really familiar from The Witcher 3. All in all, it feels like a grounded project, and it's something I can definitely believe in. Having something look a bit ropey amid all the polish? Well, if anything, that convinced me further that Cyberpunk 2077 is a real thing. It is deliverable, and even while the guns aren't that much fun to watch right now, it's still a game I want to play. And there you go, 6 things we liked about Cyberpunk 2077 and 1 thing we didn't. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, we've got loads more for you to watch on Cyberpunk and other topics. Some of those should be on screen now, so do give one of those a click. Do like, subscribe and ring the bell icon so you don't miss anything else from Eurogamer, but most importantly, thank you very much for watching and have a lovely day.